I presented this session for the first time at MathsConf38 in Dudley on Saturday, June the 21st, 2025. It's called The Power of Stories, and I wanted to share this more widely, so I decided to record it and upload it to YouTube. I hope that you enjoy it. If we're already acquainted, sorry for the next minute or so, and if we're not, this is a little bit about me. So my name's Dave Taylor, and I am enjoying my 17th year in secondary maths education. That includes 1 year out of the classroom as head of curriculum for maths at AQA, and in my time in the classroom in schools in and around Leeds, I've been curriculum leader, lead practitioner, and I also worked part-time as a CPD lead for Complete Maths. If you don't know me from these roles, you may also know me from my work as a resource author with increasingly difficult questions, backward faded maths, and then example problem past papers, or you may know these as backward faded past papers. If you haven't seen my resources, you can find them at taylorda01.weebly.com, and should you wish to contact me, you'll find me on @taylorda01 on most social media channels. So this session, The Power of Stories, was inspired by a couple of people, but most notably Rob Easterway, after he presented as part of a couple of AQA events that we organised in February and March of this year. It gave me a lot of food for thought, and I started to write a session about it and submitted my proposal for the conference. A major coincidence, about 3 weeks ago, I was watching the 1994 box office hit The Flintstones with my 8-year-old, and at the end, the dictaphone begins to tell a story. It, I've really got no idea, but let's go with it, says, "Gather round, everyone. I'll tell you the tale of an unsophisticated man caught up in a treacherous web of power, deceit, and lust." And everyone gathers around, and they listen, hanging on its every word. I mean, I was hanging on its every word. It sounds like a great story. Stories help us to connect, to build a connection, a relationship, and trust. I vaguely remember sitting with my grandparents being read to, and whether these are actual memories or not, I treasure them greatly. I remember telling my year 11s about 5 years ago about how my favourite time of the day was my daughter's bedtime. Since she was born, we made sure that we read to her daily, and their response was, "Do people actually do that?" When she was a baby, it gave me a way to build a relationship as secondary caregiver, and as she grew and became more aware of what was happening, I would read and she would listen attentively, eyes full of expectation and a face full of wonder. This curiosity felt like a gift, and I sometimes still experience it, but given my experience in secondary school, it'll run out soon, and I don't want that to happen. In the next 20 minutes or so, we'll explore why stories are so powerful. I'll give some examples of stories which may engage learners in the classroom, and a couple of other things to grab attention in lessons. In the first section, I want to consider why stories are such a powerful way to grab attention and how they can be leveraged to increase engagement in lessons and build a relationship with learners. I'm not talking about building relationships by finding out their favourite football team or by providing extrinsic motivation. I'm talking about building trust in your role as a teacher and being seen as a towering intellect by those in your care. Well, it turns out that stories are hardwired into our very biology. Our brains arrive with the cognitive machinery needed to understand stories and develop our own to share with others. We're storytelling organisms that use narrative structures to organise our thoughts. We use stories to recall facts, and as a result, our knowledge is based on stories themselves. It should come as no surprise then that the history of early mankind shows evidence of storytelling, and that it has been present from the beginning of time. Stories existed long before the written word, and when the written word did arrive, this only helped stories to spread further. They were one of the only ways of recording history, but as stories are shared over generations, accuracy is often lost. Stories are designed to entertain, inform, and inspire, and much of the time, this leads to legend. The film Catch Me If You Can is a modern-day retelling of a true story with many elements exaggerated to grab attention. No one wants to hear about a guy who wore a pilot uniform and used a fake ID once. They want to hear about deceit, flying 1,000,000 miles for a major airline under a fake name and living the high life. You don't want to hear about a man who posed as a doctor once but never operated on a patient. You want to know about the imposter who performs surgeries without expertise. What you want to hear about is a charismatic con man who always outsmarted the system, and Frank Abagnale Jr. wasn't exactly that. He sold himself as that to sell books, in the same way that Tommy Hilfiger's rise to stardom was based on an advert in Times Square stating that he's a well-known fashion designer alongside Ralph Lauren and Calvin Klein. And all of a sudden, Tommy Hilfiger clothes start flying off the shelves. I think that we can begin to sell mathematics in a similar vein, moving away from repetitive processes and moving the needle from boring across to interesting. Some stories fall flat and others enthrall. The Social Network, a film in 2010, would be less of a story without a fictional breakup and revenge story. It'd be less of a story without the malice shown and the displayed lack of empathy. Now, a story might be based in truth, but the personalities and relationships involved are exaggerated for the drama that engages an audience. I'm not suggesting that spreading misinformation is a good thing, but a few white lies and slight mistruths feel acceptable to add a little bit of colour, so long as the important stuff, which for us is the teaching content, is 100% accurate. The colour that we're adding is to gain attention from otherwise disengaged teenagers, dispelling the myth that maths is boring. Now, with that in mind, please accept my disclaimer that the truth behind the following stories may be a little questionable. So like I've said previously, this was inspired by Rob Easterway's conference session about Shakespeare's mathematical life and times. I won't be sharing stories from Rob's session, so please do try and see him speak or buy his book. But my biggest takeaway, and I'm not sure that this was Rob's intention, was that Shakespeare was basically illiterate and innumerate, and that if he time travelled to the present day, he'd probably be in a bottom set and going on to college to resit both maths and English, telling everyone that he'll be a famous playwright one day, and his teachers suggesting that he should probably look at a trade instead. Now imagine being a lower attaining learner and hearing that you're a higher attainer than William Shakespeare. Now it might only last a moment, but that's a massive confidence boost. Now this is the cover of Rob's book, which again is a beautiful image. Shakespeare formed of numbers and well worth sort of purchasing and seeing Rob speak. I think we'll start my stories then with the letter X. And the reason that we use X as the unknown so commonly is apparently the result of a historical accident involving translation. So algebra originated in the Islamic world. A prominent mathematician, Al-Khwarizmi, wrote algebra in the 9th century with a focus on solving equations. And this book was brought to Europe by the Spanish. In the book, the Arabic letter shay was used to mean the thing that we're trying to find. Now, unfortunately, the Spanish voice box can't create a sh sound, so they used a k sound, represented by the Greek letter chi. When translated to Latin, this became X. And as this became a thing, René Descartes used X as the first of 3 unknowns in the 17th century. And his influence meant that this notation became commonplace in mathematics as mathematics became more established as a discipline. It's also said that the origins of the Cartesian plane are around Descartes trying to describe the position of a spider on the ceiling of his room, which is replicable in many classrooms and well worth trying to do with kids. I'll move on to a whole turn. And my favourite question to ask when looking at the sum of angles in a whole turn is, what is a year? 365 days, 366 days when I say no to that one, 12 months, 52 weeks, they're all common answers. But rarely do you hear the amount of time it takes the sun to orbit the Earth, as was the definition about 4,000 years ago with the Babylonians. They tracked the position of the sun in the sky, and with their base 60 number system, coupled with mathematical convenience, they settled on 360 days, and that defined 1 degree to be the amount of turn that the sun goes through in 1 day. Now there's much more to talk about here with calendars, with new months named after Emperor Augustus and Julius Caesar. And I'll probably add that to the website at some point. But at the moment, we're talking about a whole turn and not the calendars. Now, at the point that the metric system was established, it was suggested that a whole turn should be 400 gradients, or gons. A right angle would be 100 gradients, which would make a whole turn 400 gradients. That would make a right angle align with the metric system as a power of 10. And what we actually have is a system where the right angle being 90 degrees is based on the whole turn being 360 degrees. But this decision would have reversed that relationship. Now, it's a limited adoption, but gradients are still supported by many calculators and are rarely used outside specific technical fields, because the historical routing and mathematical convenience of 360 degrees meant that much of the world stuck with it, in the same way that the UK committed to going fully metric in 1965, and they agreed a 10-year transition period 60 years ago. So that's going well. Now, my dad would happily send me to the corner shop for a quarter of spice, but sending your kid to the bloke on the corner for spice now holds a wildly different connotation than it did in 1998. Pi, we'll move on to next, has such a rich history. The Babylonians 4,000 years ago used pi as 3.125, and the Egyptians used 3.1605. Archimedes, over a millennium later, used a method placing the circle between two regular polygons and finding their perimeters to show that pi was between 3.14 and 3.1429. Now, by the time we've reached the 5th century, pi is known to 7 decimal places. And in the 16th century, mathematicians have got to 35 decimal places by hand. In 1949, computers have now extended our accuracy to 2037 decimal places, and as of April 2025, pi is known to 300 trillion digits. Now, NASA managed to land on celestial bodies with 15 decimal places for pi, and quantum physics needs no more than 32 decimal places, which begs the question, if 32 decimal places is adequate for quantum physics, why on earth does Suresh Kumar Sharma want to recite 70,030 decimal places of pi, which is the current Guinness World Record? In the Middle Ages, we were inaccurate, but those who celebrate Pi Approximation Day will be relieved to see that this is a long-standing approximation. And in 1897, a bill was raised to legislate the value of pi as 3.2, probably because it's easier to calculate with, but that was seen off by someone with greater intelligence. Idiocracy in action, I think that would have been. And then finally on pi, William Shanks published a value of pi to 707 decimal places in 1873. And this was used with authority for many years. Unfortunately, the 527th decimal place and each subsequent decimal place was found to be wrong, and that led to many plaques, encyclopedias, and monuments requiring many amendments, which I guess must be a little bit embarrassing, but thankfully he died by that time, so William Shanks wasn't that embarrassed by that. Moving on to Pythagoras, and I think it's a shame that a significant proportion of learners leave school believing Pythagoras to be something that you do rather than a historical figure. Pythagoreans may have been the first to prove this formally, but the ancient Babylonians and Indians acknowledged this relationship over 1,000 years before Pythagoras existed. Now, I saw Chris Bolton speak about 10 years ago, suggesting that the philosopher and mathematician that we know and love, Pythagoras of Samos, came to prominence a number of years after a younger Pythagoras, also of Samos, who was a champion boxer. So maybe the boxer retires having demonstrated physical strength, becomes a philosopher demonstrating mental strength, and he develops a secretive society called the semicircle. The semicircle was a bit of a cult, with beliefs that all is number and certain numbers were sacred. 10, for example, was considered the perfect number, symbolized by the tetractys. That's a triangle made of 10 dots. Whereas now we consider 6, 28, 496 and 8,128 to be perfect numbers. They also believed that the soul was immortal and passed through cycles of rebirth. So the Tetratis, which is shown, you might recognise as the arrangement of bowling pins. And maybe this is the biggest indication of how society has fallen, with this arrangement of numbers being seen as sacred by the Pythagoreans, and now we throw heavy balls at it, hoping for a strike. Students at the semicircle took a vow of silence. An induction of 5 years was a kind of mental and spiritual purification, and they also took a vow of vegetarianism, amongst other vows, but no beans, thank you. And Pythagoras was treated as a god. It was a bit like a brotherhood, and their mottos were, know thyself, alongside all is number. Now, Pythagoras left no written record of his work, and all that we believe we know about Pythagoras relies on what later philosophers said about him. One such story is that he chose to die rather than run through a field of beans, as was his hatred of beans, and another is that Hippasus was killed over the discovery of irrational numbers. Such was the divinity of numbers and ratio. Ultimately, due to suspicion and envy of their secretive and elitist community, the Pythagorean meeting house was the target of an arson attack which killed many members, and Pythagoras is said to have died either in this attack or soon after, having fled and then refused to run through a bean field because either they contained souls, they resembled embryos, or, and I can attest to this, they caused bodily effects described as impure. But all of this rich and interesting history is often distilled down to the words square, square, add, square root, or square, square, subtract, square root. And I think that that's an entertaining sort of bit of information that learners would gain more from, other than, see this triangle, square, square, add, square root. And that might engage them a bit more in what we're doing in the mathematics classroom. If you do get Robbie Easterway's book, Robert Record is a name that you'll find in there, and he was a wealth mathematician of the 16th century. And he was a pivotal figure in the history of mathematics. He wrote the first maths books in English, which made maths more accessible to those who didn't speak Latin. And he was the person who first established the equal sign in 1557, using a pair of parallel lines, as he claimed that nothing can be more equal than that. He also introduced the concept of balancing equations, which makes sense, given that he introduced the equal sign. He introduced radicals to English mathematics and taught about the Pythagorean theorem using Pythagorean triples in his works, and he introduced the terms root, cubic, and zenzik, zenzik meaning squared, which led to zenzai zenzai zenzik, which means the square of the square squaredly, and is a really nice link between the powers of x and product of prime factors. Prime powers beyond 2 and 3 are given the name of sursolid. X to the power of 5 is a sursolid, and x to the power of 7 is the second sursolid. X to the power of 6 described as a zenzi cube, a squared cube, and x to the power of 12 as a zenzi cube, and x to the power of 18 as a zenzi cube, that is a square of cubic cubes. Now, this might not be useful in a GCSE maths exam, but it's certainly an engaging story from the history of mathematics and has learners sitting up in their chairs. The hosts of a podcast called Beyond Good talk about forward lean as a measure of engagement, and this is the kind of thing that has learners on the edge of their seats. So this is a little bit less mathematical, but I find it's an interesting story in pattern spotting and correlation versus causation. So the Phantom of Heilbronn, also known as the Woman Without a Face, is a female serial killer whose existence was inferred from DNA evidence at 40 crime scenes across Austria, France, and Germany. Of those 40 crime scenes, 6 of those were murders, one of which was that of a female police officer. And a €300,000 reward was offered for the capture of this female serial killer. Until, in 2009, investigators concluded that no such woman existed. It became apparent that the DNA that was used to infer the existence of the female serial killer belonged to a woman who had worked at the factory which made the cotton swabs used to collect the DNA. and DNA contamination had occurred when they were being packed in the factory. And finally, the word pyramid is a slight tangent away from stories, but further towards etymology and keywords. So the word pyramid is not an Egyptian word. They use the word mer, meaning place of ascension, as the body finds its final resting place and the soul ascends to the heavens. Pyramid is from the Greek word pyramis, and when the Greeks visited Egypt, they called the tombs of their rulers pyramids. Now this is because they looked like a snack they would buy at the market. So a pyramid is called a pyramid because it looks like a wheat-based snack from back home. So stories aren't the only way we can engage learners. It was commented by my line manager that using etymology to introduce keywords is a great way to get that forward lean. And here's a few more ways that we might be able to leverage that and move the needle across to interesting from boring. So teaching maths is sometimes described as teaching keywords. And sometimes the best way to do this is to look at the roots of each word we want learners to engage with. Perimeter, for example, comes from the Greek words for around and measure. Circumference comes from the Latin words for around and carry. So perimeter and circumference are about going around the shape. And if you get that, you're unlikely to forget that that's what perimeter is when compared to area, for example. Now, there are many others, but I'll leave that for you to research. I will, however, mention my favourite, though, which is helicopter. Often shortened to copter, which is incorrect because the roots are not heli and copter. The roots of helicopter are helico and pter. Helico meaning spiral, like the double helix in science and DNA, and pter meaning wing. So a helicopter is literally called spiral wing. Pter, like the winged dinosaur pterodactyl. Guided reading, again, looks at literacy across the curriculum. And I think that you probably gain some leverage in these guided reading tasks from Nicola Whiston. So this can help with comprehension of texts and highlight interesting people and stories from the rich history of mathematics. Learners engage with the text in the middle and answer the questions around the outside. So if your SLT are looking for your offering for literacy across the curriculum, this might be a good starting point. And finally, media is a great way to engage learners. They love a good video in class, and Dan Mayer's 3-act math tasks are a great way to engage curiosity. I'd also heavily recommend Numberphile's YouTube channel with content around infinity, cutting cakes, the Monty Hall problem, the maths behind rock, paper, scissors, a Google, and Frobenius numbers, which are excellent when studying multiples. I'd recommend Eliane, which is Eliane McDonald describes herself as a mathemactivist and a craftomatician, unleashing the beauty of maths for all to see. So I found her content particularly useful when looking at tessellations lately. And I'm also a big fan of podcasts like No Such Thing as a Fish and Evil Genius for interesting stories and sparks of information. And that's the end of my session on stories, called The Power of Stories, and the end of my limited storybook. Now, you can't share these stories until you've heard them, so I would like to hear more and share them on my website so that other teachers can gain more from this as well. So I'd like to know, what are your favourite math stories which entertain, inform and inspire? So please take a few moments to share these with me via email on d.taylor3142@gmail.com or on social media on @TaylorDA01. So thanks for watching. Do head over to taylorda01.weebly.com for these stories and resources, and please do get in touch if you wish to do so. I'm on @TaylorDA01 on social media, and I am on LinkedIn @Dave Taylor. Have a wonderful day.